and thanks for joining me for this screen capture as we go over the scriptures that I used when I presented this particular lesson, Oh Be Careful, on March the 20th, 2011 at the St. Mary's Church of Christ in Warren County, Tennessee. The title of this lesson comes from the VBS song, and you can see it here on the screen. There's a little VBS song that begins, Oh Be Careful, and it's usually sung to children, and it goes, Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. For the Father up above is looking down in love. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Now, the little song goes on to say, be careful, ears, what you hear. Be careful, little mouth, what you say. Be careful, little hands, what you do. And be careful, little feet, where you go. Now, the purpose of this lesson, of course, this was presented to adults, but it's a great lesson for anybody. We should be careful what we see, what we hear, what we say, what our hands do, and what our feet, where our feet go. So, without further ado, let's look at some of the scriptures that I used when I presented this particular lesson. The first one coming up here on the screen is the lesson text coming out of Matthew chapter 5, verses 29 through 30. Coming out of the New King James, it says there, If your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. For it is more profitable for you that one of your members perish than for the whole body to be cast into hell. Verse 30, And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you, for it is more profitable for you than one of your members perish, than for your whole body to be cast into hell. Now, there's a lot of people, when they hear this particular scripture, it is somewhat confusing. You know, is the Lord really saying we should be plucking out our eyes and cutting off our hand? I think really what he's trying to say here is use all means necessary to avoid sin, is what he's saying there. So, anyway, let's move on now to the actual scriptures that we're going to use in this lesson. For the first point, as you remember, it was be careful, little eyes, what you see. And what I used for this particular lesson is the example of David and Bathsheba, coming out of 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 1 through 4. Probably you are familiar with this. It says, It happened in the spring of the year, at the time when kings go out to battle, that David sent Joab and his servants with him and all of Israel. And they destroyed the people of Ammon and besieged Rabbah. But David remained at Jerusalem. Then verse 2, here's where he begins to have some trouble here. Then it happened one evening that David arose from his bed and walked on the roof of the king's house. And from the roof he saw a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful to behold. Verse 3, So David sent and inquired about the woman, and someone said, Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? Verse 4, Then David sent messengers and took her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, for she was cleansed from her impurity, and she returned to her house. Now, this particular scripture, again, describes the sin that King David committed. He saw a beautiful woman, he lusted after her, he acted upon that impulse and called Bathsheba to the palace, and as we know, committed adultery with her. A child was conceived. She tells King David about the child, and Uriah the Hittite is called in from the battlefield. David tries to get Uriah to go home, sleep with his wife so the sin will be covered. He won't. And to make a long story short, David sends a note by Uriah's own hand to Joab, the commander of the army, which says, when you get in the thickest part of the fight, withdraw from Uriah the Hittite. That's exactly what happens, and Uriah the Hittite dies. David thinks his sin is covered until the prophet Nathan confronts him. And so here's what happens. David is confronted by the prophet Nathan, and the prophet Nathan tells a little story that ends with a crescendo of, you are the man, you're the one. And so David is confronted eventually by God because of his sin. Now, the main point I want to mention in this, and of course it's my understanding from things that I've read and hearing other people talk about this, that pornography is a really big problem on the internet. There's especially men. Men are visual creatures, and they get involved in viewing these things. And the next step, the next logical step, is to actually act upon those things, and that's a problem. And King David was no exception. He saw that beautiful woman bathing herself, and so he lusted upon her and wanted her, and actually acted upon the lust. So again, the title, the part of this lesson is, "Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see." We have to be careful what we allow ourselves to watch. Okay, now let's move on. We'll look at a secondary scripture that kind of supports this, and move right along. This is simply where Jesus Christ himself pointed out that it's very important to be careful what you watch, because just looking at a woman to lust after her, you're committing adultery already with her in your heart. Now, let's move to this next scripture, Luke chapter 8, verses 8, actually just verse 18. It says, "Therefore take heed how you hear, for whoever has, to him will be given, and whoever does not have, even what he seems to have will be taken from him." What you hear is very important, I think, because I remember when I was an Olin Mills church photographer, and we traveled, or I traveled all over Middle Tennessee and Southern Kentucky taking pictures, and I would listen to talk radio, I would listen to the radio, country, classical, rock and roll, jazz. I'd listen to a little bit of everything. I was very eclectic. But what really amazed me is some of the so-called shock jocks, such as Howard Stern, people like that. They would say things, and the purpose was simply to shock, as the name implies. And we as Christians have to be careful. You know, and when someone starts speaking in that way, using that kind of language, we need to back off. We need to just not listen. So that is, be careful, little ears, what you hear. All right, now let's look at a secondary scripture that I used with this, and this scripture from Philippians I used simply to make the point that there's a test when you're listening to something that you should apply. Coming out of Philippians 4, 8, and 9. I encourage you to read this on your own, but you know, when we're hearing something, we should ask ourselves, is it true? Is it noble? Is it just? Is it pure? And so that's the reason that I use that scripture. Now let's go on to be careful, little mouth, what you say. And the best scripture that I think goes along with this is comes from James. James chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, as you see here on the screen. "Even so the tongue is a little member and boasts great things. See how a great forest a little fire kindles. And the tongue is a fire, a world of iniquity. The tongue is so set among our members that it defiles the whole body, and it sets on fire the course of nature, and it is set on fire by hell." The point is simply here that we, especially those of us who claim the name Christian, we need to be careful how we talk, and the type of language that we use, because you know there are people who are listening to us, and so often people will use the way we talk to justify their life and say, well, they're no better than I am. So we have to be careful about that. Again, there's a lot of examples and things like that when I'm actually presenting the lesson that I toss in. But again, the purpose of these screen captures is not to preach the lesson, it's simply to go over the scripture. So let's move on now to our next point. And this is a secondary point that goes along with that, which is simply that every idle word that we speak, we're going to be held accountable for that. All right, let's move on now to Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19. And let's see if we can separate that from this other one here, and simply show that there's 6 things that the Lord hates. There's 7 that's an abomination to Him. One of those is hands that shed innocent blood. Again, in the little song we sing, "Oh, be careful, little hands, what you do." Hands can shed innocent blood. There's other things hands that can do, such as Ephesians 4:28, where it says stealing. You know, hands can steal, and we need to be careful not to be doing that. And so that brings us to our last point, which is still in Proverbs chapter 6, verses 16 through 19. Of those 7 things that God hates, another one in this category is feet that are swift in running to evil. And so we need to be careful not to have those kind of feet, the feet that are always wanting to go places they should not go, and to follow after things that they shouldn't. What we should do is found here in Psalms 23. Where it tells us, of course, this is the 23rd Psalm, but specifically, notice these words. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me, that's where my feet are going. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. Listen to this. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk, again, through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff comfort me. All right, well, that is our screen capture for the lesson that I presented on the March the 20th, 2011 at the St. Mary's Church of Christ in Warren County, Tennessee. Again, it's be careful, little eyes what you see, ears what you hear, mouth what you say, hands what you do, and feet where you go. Thanks for joining me, and we'll talk to you next time.